My name is Darlene Montgomery. I am 68 years old, and the years sit heavy in my bones but sharper in my memory. Once, I was a senior accountant at a property firm, a woman people thanked sincerely, who could walk into a room and be looked at as someone who mattered. Those days are gone. Now, I live alone in the house my late husband Walter left me. Within these walls, we built our quiet life, raised our only son, Ryan. He was my world, and I believed I was his until the day of the wedding I never knew had taken place, until the voice message that shattered me like a glass striking stone. It happened on a Thursday. I was standing in the kitchen, the knife gliding through apples, their pale flesh curling into the bowl. I was baking a pie I promised Ryan cinnamon, not too sweet, exactly the way his father liked it, the way Ryan once begged for it as a boy. The house smelled of warmth, of sugar and memory. Then my phone buzzed. A voice message. Odd, since Ryan and I had spoken that morning. With flour dusting my thumb, I pressed play. She's still here. God, I can't stand that old hag. Once she's gone, the $7.8 million estate is ours. Paris, here we come. The words split the air. My legs did not move. My hands did not shake. But something deep inside me collapsed, something that had endured years of silent giving, of small sacrifices never tallied. I pressed play again, as if hearing it twice might soften it, might make it untrue. It did not. Ryan's voice was steady, cruel in its casualness. And then Lena, her laugh, sharp and bright, like a knife wrapped in silk. They were whispering together, teenagers planning a prank in the dark. But this was no prank. This was my erasure. I stood frozen as the cinnamon burned black on the stove, smoke curling into the ceiling. I did not move to stop it. Instead, I walked slowly into the dining room, to the sideboard where Walter's photograph still sat, his fishing hat tilted, his grin forever crooked. Ryan once looked so much like him. But now he sounded like someone I would never open my door to. I laid my palms flat against the wood of the dining table. I could feel the grooves, the grain, the echoes of decades' birthday candles blown out, Christmas mornings unwrapped, college acceptance letters read with trembling hands. It had also heard my whispered prayers when Walter was sick, and my quiet sobs after his diagnosis. And now it heard something else, the silence of betrayal. And then my voice, calm, controlled, terrifyingly steady, into my attorney's voicemail. Execute the trust transfer immediately. I had set up the clause years ago, hidden, silent, waiting. I had thought it was for illness, for age, for the day I could no longer decide for myself. Never once had I imagined it would be my shield against my own son. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in bed, the lights off, listening to the wind claw at the maple tree outside my window, the same wind that once rocked Ryan to sleep in my arms when he was a baby. My mind replayed the message again and again, Lena's voice rolling the word Paris like it was a prize for outliving me. But the thorn lodged deepest beneath my ribs was Ryan's silence. For years I had believed betrayal, if it came, would come from the outside, from strangers, not from the boy I raised through sickness and heartbreak. Not from the child who once wept when I scraped my knee in the garden. Yet the message was clear. I was not his mother anymore. I was a burden, a bank account with wrinkles, a formality to be cleared before his future could begin. At sunrise, I rose, boiled water, and poured it into the porcelain teacup I had used every morning since Walter died, a gift from our 35th anniversary, white with hand-painted flowers, its rim chipped from years of use. I traced that crack with my thumb and whispered into the emptiness, "I'm not dead yet, but I might as well be." That was how they spoke of me, like I was already gone, a shadow delaying their life of luxury. But as I sipped my tea, I felt the weight of the trust clause settling into place. Every penny Walter had left property, stocks, the retirement fund I never touched, was now sealed beyond their reach unless I allowed it. The voice message wasn't only a betrayal, it was a warning. And I had heard it, and in that silence, I finally saw the truth. They didn't forget me. They chose to erase me. The next morning, the house felt hollow, like a seashell pressed to the ear. I shuffled into the kitchen as I grinned. I had for decades, my slippers whispering against the faded hardwood floor. I moved automatically. Fill the kettle, set the cups, one for me, one for Ryan, or Lena, or anyone who used to sit at this table and laugh over burnt toast or late-night leftover pie. Steam rose from the kettle like a sigh. I took down 2 porcelain cups, matching ones with little violets I'd bought from a market in Charleston. I placed them on the table, added a spoon to each saucer, poured the tea. Then I paused. What was I doing? No one was coming to join me. I stared at the second cup, the one meant for company, meant for love, and I felt the weight of it. My hands were still warm from the kettle, but something inside me turned cold. I lifted the cup, poured it slowly back into the teapot, and set it upside down on the saucer. 1 cup was enough. It had to be. I sat down, hands curled around the warm porcelain like it could thaw the ache spreading through my chest, but it didn't. Out of habit, I reached for my phone, and there it was, a public post. Lena's Instagram feed, glowing and polished, as if joy had been painted on with a fine brush. A wedding photo. Her, in a lace dress, the one I paid for. I recognized the hem I had paid extra to, have lengthened. The neckline we altered twice until she smiled into the mirror and whispered, "This is the one, Mama." D. My throat tightened. She looked radiant, a golden glow in a vineyard. Somewhere upstate, the caption read, "Married the love of my life yesterday." Private, intimate, perfect. I stared at it longer than I should have, not because I needed more pain, but because I wanted to understand. In the photo, her parents sat beside her. Her mother in a navy gown, her father raising a mound, glass. They looked proud, content, family. I wasn't in the picture, not even in the background. I'd bought that dress, paid the venue deposit, funded, the catering. I remembered writing the check, thinking it would mean something, that I was giving not just money, but myself, a piece of my heart stitched into every lace detail. And yet I hadn't been deemed special. Another swipe, another photo, a clip of their first dance. Lena's father twirled, purred gently. Ryan stood in the corner, hand in his pocket, watching with a quiet smile. A part of me expected, hoped, to see some sign of hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, a glance toward the camera as if searching for the person missing, but he never looked for me. He looked happy. Meanwhile, I sat in a kitchen that had once echoed with his toddler giggles. Now it held only the sound of a ticking wall clock and the soft chime of my spoon against porcelain. I glanced at the fridge, a list of groceries stuck on with a magnet shaped like a strawberry. I had written eggs, flour, vanilla a few days ago. I'd baked shortbread cookies, Ryan's favorite. I'd packed them in a little tin with a bow. They were still on the counter, untouched. I had planned to hand them to Lena the day she left for what I thought was a pre-wedding getaway. But that day had been the wedding. They never said goodbye, just smiled, said they had errands and walked out the door. And I, in my quiet hope, had wished them well. My gaze drifted to the living room where my dress still hung. Pale lavender silk, simple, elegant. I'd had it dry, cleaned, just in case she changed her mind. Just in case there was still time for grace. I rose from the chair and walked over to it, brushed my hand down the fabric. It felt like trying to touch the past. The silence was sharp, not peaceful but pointed, like a silence that had chosen me, one that said, "You are not needed here." I turned back toward the kitchen. The sun had shifted. Light spilled through the window in slanted gold lines, warming the wooden table. I stared at the empty chair, across from mine, and it hit me, not like a punch, but like the slow sinking of realization. I wasn't family. I was funding. I wasn't part of their future. I was just a remnant of their past they didn't have the courage to discard until now, and somewhere between the tea and the silence, I understood what had really been lost. It wasn't just the wedding invitation. It was my place in their hearts, my seat at their table, and like That second teacup I poured and turned over, I finally accepted the truth. I was extra. Not special, just extra. And no one makes room for leftovers at a wedding table. I didn't cry. Not that morning, nor the morning after. But something inside me changed. I walked over to the printer, slid in a fresh ream of paper, and opened a folder I had labeled but never touched. It was titled, simply Ryan and Lena Expenses. 3 years, that's how long I had been, tracking every payment I made to keep their lives from unraveling. I printed every line, every receipt, every invoice, utilities, groceries, rent top-ups, Lena's physical therapy after the accident, Ryan's insurance payments when he was between jobs, the down payment for their hybrid SUV, the entire catering deposit for a wedding I wasn't invited to. Pages and pages slid out of the printer, warm and damning. I stacked them neatly on the kitchen table beside, a small calculator and a half-eaten muffin. I punched in each figure like it was a prayer to clarity. $284,672. That's what it cost me to be invisible. The irony, I didn't regret the money. Not then, not fully. Because when you're a mother, you don't see numbers, you see needs. You see hungry mouths. You see panic in your son's voice at 1:13 a.m. when he says the mortgage bounced again. You see Lena crying because her dress doesn't zip after surgery and she can't afford a new one. You see a car with no brakes, a fridge with no food, and you had to fix it. I used to tell myself, if I can help, I should. But now staring at that total over $250,000, they heard a quieter voice. And if they never say thank you, if they build a life without you in it, if they look at your generosity and still decide you're not worth a seat, I sat down and for the first time I wrote the truth. Not about the money, but about what it cost me. It cost me the roast dinners I skipped for months just to keep their pantry full. It cost me the new glasses I never bought, the trip to Arizona I always postponed. It cost me the pride I swallowed every time Lena rolled her eyes when I didn't get her influencer talk. Every time Ryan said, "Mom, you wouldn't understand." But this wasn't just about dollars. This was about value. I turned the page to a different document, one I hadn't looked at in over a decade. It was the trust my late husband had established before he passed, tucked away with our estate planner. The first line read, "Upon the death of the grantor, the trust shall pass to Darlene May Whitmore in full, including all real estate, business assets, and investments, totaling $7.8 million. I read it twice, then 3 more times. Somehow, after all these years of giving, I had forgotten that I was never just a helper in someone else's story. I was once the center of a man's world, a man who trusted me, honored me, and built a life with me, not around me. And Ryan, he didn't know the clause that came after. Any further distribution shall be left to the discretion of the trustee, Darlene Whitmore, with a stipulation that said, distributions are contingent upon active, respectful participation in the family unit. It was vague, perhaps too kind, but it was binding, and the truth began to unfold like a second sunrise. My silence had never been weakness. It had been faith. Faith that they would remember who I was. Faith that love could be repaid in kind. But now I understood something that stung like lemon on an open wound. I wasn't being punished because I gave too little. I was discarded because I gave too much. And like all things we hand over too freely, time, trust, tenderness, they assumed it would never, run out. But here's the thing about trust. Even legal ones come with terms. I folded the document slowly, pressing the edge with my thumb. There was still a part of me that wanted to believe Ryan was simply blind, not cruel, that he had been led, that Lena's words had clouded his heart, that maybe, just maybe, he didn't know what he was, choosing when he turned away. But the wedding wasn't a mistake, it was a statement, and so was mine. I picked up to the phone and dialed my attorney. "Hi Meredith, it's Darlene. I think it's time we reviewed the distribution terms of the Whitmore Trust." I paused. No, rush. But perhaps you can block off some time this week. I'll be bringing some printed records, because if I was only bank account to them, then I would start treating this like a transaction, and this time the terms would be mine. I wore my navy cardigan, the one Harold used to say made me look like I had a plan and a backup. I wasn't sure if I had either when I stepped into the car, but I knew exactly where I was going. Mabel Given lived just off Sycamore Lane, in a quiet little cottage wrapped in ivy and secrets. We hadn't talked in a while. Life had happened and grief had built tall walls, but she was still my person. Always had been. I brought a tin of shortbread. She opened the door in, her house slippers and a sarcastic smile. Well, the prodigal widow returns. I come bearing cookies, I replied. Then all is forgiven. She brewed chamomile tea, the good kind. We sat by her bay window as rain dotted the glass in tiny whispers. I slid my phone across the table. Play the message, I said. Her eyes narrowed. She tapped and listened. At first, her face was unreadable. Then her jaw clenched. She closed her eyes as the words poured out. I can't stand this old hag anymore. Soon she'll be taking her final nap. We'll be spending her money in Paris. Mabel didn't speak right away. She simply exhaled long and slow. I thought, Lena loved him, she murmured. I thought she saw what kind of man he could be. She does love him, I said quietly. But not the version of him I helped raise. She loves the man who's finally learned how to use someone else's kindness as leverage. She didn't argue. I told her everything. How they'd eloped, how they wore smiles stitched from lies, how my son looked away when I asked about the wedding. And then I told her what I'd done the night before. I handed her a thick folder. Mabel flipped through the printed statements, receipts, spreadsheets I had, obsessively compiled in one sleepless night. My hand had trembled while highlighting the numbers. $76,000 for their down payment. $22,400 in medical bills when Lena's mother got 2.3 mine wedding dress deposit, 2.3 mine a zero car, $11,000 premium insurance for the Lexus, $98,000 to cover the home renovation and garden wall, a dozen small things that added up to big things. Altogether $284,700 over 3 years. I watched her lips tighten into something between disbelief and fury. I wanted to prove something to myself, I said, that maybe I wasn't just being petty, that maybe this ache had arithmetic. She looked up. You shouldn't have to do math to justify feeling betrayed, Dar. Maybe. But the numbers don't lie. My love's been monetized. There was a long silence between us. Just the tick of the mantel clock and the slow steep of regret. Then Mabel said the one thing I'd hoped for. We're going to fix this. I blinked. How? You, said Harold left you that family trust, right? Yes. He set it up 10 years ago, for me and Ryan. I thought it was secure. Well, I remember Harold. It wasn't one for loose ends. Did you ever finalize the successor trustee documents? I hesitated. They're in my drawer. I never submitted the update forms after Harold passed. Mabel's eyes sparkled the way they did when we used to strategize in law school mock trials. Then we're still in time. We turn that trust irrevocable. You appoint me as temporary trustee. You transfer full control of every asset under the umbrella. Your house, the retirement accounts, the residual portfolio, everything. I froze. Ryan doesn't know the trust has this clause, she smiled, which is exactly why this will work. I sipped my tea. It tasted like the first breath after drowning, but he'll find out. Mabel leaned back. Let him. What's he going to do? Complain that his mother used the trust her husband left her to prevent being drained like a leaky faucet? I laughed. The first real laugh in days. You're sure we're not being vindictive? We're being wise. There's a difference. I stared out her window at the gray sky. In the distance, 2 crows chased a hawk. Nature didn't wait for justice. It hunted. You'll need to move fast, Mabel added. Once we lock it down, the assets become bulletproof. No one touches anything without the trust's approval. That's you or me if you prefer stealth. Stealth, I said firmly. She stood. Then I'll call the notary. You'll need to sign within 48 hours. As she disappeared down the hall, I traced the rim of my teacup. The old me might have waited, might have hoped for Ryan to apologize, for Lena to see my worth without price tags, but that version of me no longer existed. It wasn't planning revenge. I was reclaiming peace, one signature at a time. The first thing I did that morning was call a locksmith, not because I was scared. I wasn't. Not anymore. But because I needed a clean slate, a declaration to myself that I would no longer leave the doors of my life open to those who had proven they didn't value being inside. The young man arrived promptly at 9 a.m. He was polite, efficient, and didn't ask too many questions. As he unscrewed the old deadbolt Ryan once installed, I stared at the dull brass finish. I had paid for it just like I had paid for the house it secured, the car in the driveway, and the future they were enjoying without me. I watched it drop into the technician's toolbox with a soft clink. Strange how much lighter I felt hearing that sound. I changed every lock, front door, back door, garage, even the shed. It wasn't about keeping them out. It was about finally recognizing that they had let themselves out long ago. They had just forgotten to take their names off the keys. Then I drove to the bank. The teller recognized me instantly. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway. What can we do for you today?" "I need to make some changes," I said, handing her my ID. "I want to remove Ryan Holloway from all joint accounts, cancel his authorized access, and update all passwords and verification methods." She blinked. "All right. Do you want to speak with a financial officer to go over everything?" "Yes, Ethan, if he's available." Ethan was a soft-spoken man in his early 40s. For years, he'd handled our family's accounts, always with a respectful distance and a warm smile. He invited me into his office, his eyebrows lifting just slightly when I handed him the folder of documents I'd brought. "You're revoking everything?" he asked, flipping through the pages. "Power of attorney, shared cards, auto transfers." "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's long overdue." He nodded slowly, then typed a few things into his computer. I can initiate everything today. I'll just need some signatures," I signed. Pen to paper, stroke by stroke, I peeled my life back into my own hands as he organized the new documents into a crisp folder. Ethan hesitated, then looked up at me. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," he said gently, "but you've helped them live very well for the last 3 years. House, insurance, tuition, wedding deposits. I've seen the wires come in and out. You've carried them through adulthood with dignity." I met his gaze, surprised by the depth in his voice. "But now," he continued, sliding the folder across the desk, "maybe it's time you lived for yourself." That did something to me, not in a grand, cinematic way, not with tears or fireworks or triumphant music. It was softer than that, like the way a room changes when you open a window after a long winter, the way sunlight hits the floor and suddenly you can breathe again. Maybe I hadn't died when Ryan told me I was no longer needed. Maybe I had just gone quiet like an old radio left on a dusty shelf, forgotten but not broken. All it needed was someone to tune it back in. I thanked Ethan and left with my folder tucked under one arm like a compass. Outside, the air felt different, crisper, like it belonged to me again. On the way home, I stopped by the florist. It wasn't intentional. I was just driving, and there it was. Lillian's flowers nestled between the bakery and the dry cleaner. I hadn't stepped inside in years, not since, before Harold passed. But something about that moment made me pull in. I bought myself tulips. Not roses, not lies, tulips, bright orange ones that I looked like fire when the sun hit them. I didn't need a reason. I just wanted something beautiful in my home. When I got back, I set them in a crystal vase, one of the last wedding gifts Harold and I had received, and placed it by the window. The house was quiet, but no longer empty. I brewed a fresh cup of tea, opened the window, and sat down at the kitchen table, this time with only one cup. Mine. No second cup for someone who wouldn't show. No more place settings for those who had already set the table somewhere else. I wasn't dead. I was just beginning. And for the first time in years, I was curious to see where this beginning might take me. The knock was too polite. Not rushed, not nervous, just rehearsed. When I opened the door, Ryan stood there, with Lena on his right and a man I didn't recognize on his left. The man held a leather briefcase. My gut already. I knew. "Hi, Mom," Ryan said, smoothing his tie. "Can we come in?" I stepped aside. Without a word. They walked in like they still lived here. Lena glanced around the living room and gave a faint smile like she was being patient with a child. The lawyer, a wiry man in a steel gray suit, sat down without asking. He opened his briefcase and began sorting papers. With precision. Ryan gestured toward the seat across from me. "Mom, we've been talking and we think it's time to make sure everything's in order. Just some paperwork," Lena chimed in, sitting on the arm of the couch like it was hers. "You've seemed a little distracted lately. Honestly, we're just concerned." Concerned? The way she said it made me feel like a cracked vase, delicate, teetering, and ready to be placed on some forgotten shelf. "I'm fine," I said, calmly. "I've just been cleaning up." "Exactly," she said, her voice too sweet. "That's why we brought Mr. Jeffers here." The lawyer looked up. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm here on behalf of your son and daughter-in-law. They believe it would be prudent to establish financial guardianship, just a safety net, nothing binding without your approval." He laid out 3 thick documents on the coffee table, one for durable power of attorney, one for guardianship over medical and financial decisions, and the third a request for access to the trust account. I didn't look at the pages. I looked at Ryan. He couldn't meet my eyes. "You want me to hand it over?" I said, quietly. "All of it." Ryan raised his hands. "Mom, we're not trying to take anything. We just want to make sure you're okay. That your affairs are handled properly," Lena added. "Think of it like insurance. You've always trusted Ryan, haven't you?" My fingers tightened around the edge of my cardigan. I thought of the thousands I'd spent on their honeymoon to Maui, the medical bills, the nursery, the down payment, all of it. Quiet, unquestioned, out of love. And now I was. A burden to be managed. Filed, signed away. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached into the drawer beside my chair and pulled out the small USB drive. I placed it gently on the table between the 3 of us. "What's that?" Ryan asked. "A memory?" I said. "From last week." Lena's jaw stiffened. Ryan looked up. "What is this supposed to be?" I looked him straight in the eye. "It's the voice message you accidentally sent. The one where you called me a useless old hag. The one where you said, what was it again? Oh yes, that you'd be spending all my money in Paris after I took my final nap." The color drained from Lena's face. She glanced sharply at Ryan, who suddenly found his voice. "Mom, that was a joke. It was, taken out of context." "I didn't say anything yet," I replied. "You're the one filling in the blanks." Mr. Jeffers, the lawyer, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, if this is not the right time." "It's not," I said, "and neither is it the right paperwork, the right tone, or the right people." I stood slowly, my knees firm for the first time in weeks. "Ryan, Lena, I am not losing my mind. I remember everything now. Too clearly, in fact." Lena tried to interrupt. "We didn't mean." "You meant every word," I said, voice low but steady. "And now I mean mine." I pushed the documents across the table, watching them flutter to the floor like leaves in the fall. Too late to stop the season from changing. "You can go now." Ryan stood, mouth half open, unsure if he should fight or flee. Lena tugged his sleeve. "Let's go," she whispered, harshly. As they turned to leave, I added one final thing. "Oh, and Ryan," he paused, in the doorway. "Your father's trust isn't what you think it, Island," he blinked. "What do you mean?" I smiled gently. "Ask a lawyer. A good one." And then I closed the door behind them, not with anger, just with finality. The hallway felt quieter than usual, but I didn't feel alone. For the first time, in a long while, I felt awake, present, not a fading matriarch in a dusty armchair, but a woman reclaiming her name. A week passed, a week of silence, of polite distance, of reorganizing my home and my mind. I started spending more time in the sunroom again, tending to my potted gardenias, sipping chamomile, trying to remember what still made me me. I thought the worst was behind me. I thought I had reclaimed my peace. I was wrong. It started with a light blinking faintly above the window, a pane near my bedroom door. At first, I dismissed it as maybe the smoke detector, but it wasn't the usual red light. This was different. Blue, subtle, persistent. I stood on the footstool with a small mirror in hand and angled it up. What I saw stole the breath from my chest. A tiny lens tucked into the molding, like it had always been part of the house. A camera. I froze. Then slowly I stepped down, heart pounding in my ears. My hands trembled as I unplugged every outlet in my room, pulled back every curtain, opened drawers I hadn't touched in weeks. That night, I didn't sleep in my bed. I sat in the kitchen under the overhead light with my old flip phone in hand, dialing a number I hadn't used in 2 years. "Jasper, it's Darlene. I need your help." Quietly, Jasper, my late husband's old tech friend, came the next morning with a calm voice and a black toolkit. Within 30 minutes, he found 3 hidden cameras, one in the bedroom, one in the 7, hallway facing the bathroom, and another inside my closet. Each was linked to a cloud account traced to an email address under Lena Whitmore. I couldn't speak. I sat at the edge of the couch, palms flat against my knees, eyes fixed on the floorboards. I had carried them in my body, nursed Ryan through asthma attacks, sat in her rooms, alone, sold my piano to buy his first car. I taught him to tie his shoes and make French toast, and now his wife was watching me undress. Sleep exist. This was more than betrayal. This was violation. Jasper offered to help report it. I shook my head. Not yet. That afternoon, I stepped onto my porch for air and found my neighbor, Mrs. Calderon, pruning her rose bushes. She was a soft-spoken woman in her early 80s with eyes that had seen too much, but lips that rarely judged. "You all right, Darlene?" she asked without looking up. I hesitated, then walked over. "Can I ask you something strange?" She paused, then nodded. I told her, not everything, just enough. The camera, the secrecy, the excuse of concern used as a leash. Mrs. Calderon's shears stilled in her hands. "My son did the same thing," she said after a long pause. "He said it was for my safety. Said I might fall and no one would know. But you know what I found out? He was watching to see if I met up with my bridge friends. Thought they were convincing me to change my will." I blinked, stunned. "I changed the locks that same day," she continued. "Took down every frame with his photo. He still sends me birthday cards. I don't open them." We stood in silence for a moment. Just 2 old women with secrets and scissors. Later that night, I opened a dusty box in the attic and found the silver cross necklace Ryan made for me when he was 9, shaped like a child's idea of love, uneven, clumsy, but sincere. I held it in my palm and cried, not because I still loved the little boy he once was, but because that boy was gone, and what stood in his place no longer called me Mom, at least not with love. They said they cared that it was about my health, but it was control gift wrapped in the language of concern. The next morning, I walked through my home differently. I didn't flinch when the phone rang. I didn't check over my shoulder. I simply made a list. And at the top of it, I wrote one word: reclaim. Not just my property, my privacy, my life, and by God, I would. Mabel sat across from me at the kitchen table, a worn leather briefcase resting by her feet and a determined gleam in her eyes. She'd stopped by after work, hair pulled back tightly, still in her navy blazer with the faintest smell of courtroom coffee clinging to her. "I've seen worse," she said calmly, flipping through the preliminary notes I'd gathered. Bank statements, utility, bills, notes I'd scrolled on napkins when memories came back at 3 a.m. But this time, they messed with the wrong mother. Mabel wasn't just my lawyer, she was also my friend. We'd taught Sunday school together for years before she went to law school in her 42nds. And right now, she wasn't sitting across from me as a friend. She was here as an advocate. We spread everything across the table like it was a battlefield map. The USB drive with Lena's voice. I have to wait. Then the house is ours. The video footage Ethan had helped me retrieve from the indoor camera I hadn't even known existed. My medical records, clean, no signs of cognitive decline, no early signs of dementia, just grief and fatigue, something not covered in any diagnostic manual. "They're building a case that you're unfit," Mabel said, pointing to the documents Ryan and Lena had dropped off during their last visit. "That you need a conservator, that you're losing it." She didn't hide the disgust in her voice. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had once held Ryan's when he was afraid of thunderstorms, when he was learning to walk, when he got his first job. These same hands were now being painted as unreliable, unfit, unworthy of independence. "I want to fight," I said, "but I don't want to become someone hardened by revenge." "You're not fighting out of spite, Darlene. You're fighting for your right to breathe, think, and live without being managed like a child." We began organizing files, receipts, letters, calendar notes, witnesses, everything that could show I was not only lucid, but lucid enough to smell betrayal in my own home. While gathering papers in my bedroom later that evening, I opened the drawer of my late husband's nightstand. The same drawer I hadn't dared to touch in over a year. His cologne still lingered in the air, that warm, woodsy scent of cedar and tobacco. My hand brushed past old glasses, a loose button, and finally the letter. It was sealed, marked in his handwriting. If she ever forgets how strong she island, I hesitated, then opened it. "Darlene, if you're reading this, something has pushed you to the edge. I know that look, the quiet storm in your eyes. I fell in love with it, but I also feared the day you'd need it again. If, God forbid, the kids ever turn their backs on you, don't let them define your worth, especially if they see you as a burden. Choose yourself, even if it means walking alone. I love you." See? Tears spilled before I even reached the last line. I pressed the letter to my chest, holding it like a lifeline, like the warmth of him could seep through the paper and into my bones. That night, I called Mabel. "I'm ready," I told her. "Let's file everything. Let's go to court." There was a long pause, then her soft reply. "I knew you'd say that. I've already started the paperwork." The next morning, we scheduled the court hearing. The wheels were in motion now, not just legally, but inside me. I wasn't the same woman who cried silently when Ryan raised his voice. I wasn't the woman who sat still when Lena mocked my memory. I was someone else now, someone my husband had seen even when I couldn't. And as I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it near my bedside, I whispered to the quiet room, "If they see me as a burden, then they never truly saw me at all." When the envelope arrived, I thought it was just another bill or medical statement, but the seal was from the court. Inside, I found a formal notice. My own son and daughter-in-law had filed a petition to assume legal guardianship over me. In black ink on crisp white paper, it claimed I was no longer capable of managing finances or medical decisions in a rational manner. It took my breath away, not because I hadn't expected a storm, but because they had made it official, because now it was written in the language of courts. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened the front door and stepped outside. The late afternoon sun was low, draping everything in a honeyed quiet. I sat down on the top step of my porch, court, papers trembling in my hands, and I just sat there 20 minutes, not blinking, not moving, just the sound of the birds, a car passing in the distance. I didn't feel weak. I felt something far more dangerous. Still, my fingers traced the sharp edge of the paper. This wasn't just about a piece of property or money anymore. This was about erasing me. I wanted the court to believe I was gone before I was even gone. And if they succeeded, I would lose my rights. My voice, my name, Ryan, my son, the boy. I nursed through bronchitis when he was 8, who used to fall asleep with his head on my lap during thunderstorms. The boy who once told his third-grade class, "My mom is my superhero." Now that boy was trying to tell the government I was too broken to exist on my own. I looked down at the phrase they wrote. Subject is believed to have declined significantly in cognitive function, showing signs of confusion and paranoia. They were twisting my clarity into confusion. They were calling my caution paranoia. They weren't just stealing my estate. They were stealing my dignity. And the worst part wasn't even the words on the page. It was what they meant behind them. That my son saw me not as a mother, not even as a person, but as a problem to be solved, a vault to be cracked, a door with a password. "Your mother's love used to be enough," I whispered. "Now they want to change the lock on my heart and install a PIN code instead." Still holding the papers, I stood up, slowly. My knees ached, but I didn't let them shake. This was the moment I realized something I hadn't dared admit before. They weren't going to stop. Not until I was erased entirely, filed under incapable, tucked into some facility where their visits were optional and their control was absolute. They wanted me out of the picture to manage my wealth without the burden of the woman who built it, but I wasn't going anywhere. Not quietly, not politely, and certainly not with their lies as my final chapter. Inside, I placed the summons on my kitchen table. Then I picked up the phone. It was time to go to war. A quiet one, yes, but one I would fight with every ounce of the woman my husband fell in love with, every bit of the mother I had been, and every shard of the woman they wanted to write off. They forgot one thing. I may be old, but I remember everything, and I was done being silent. The court hearing was set for mid-November, and Ryan's petition included the most humiliating statement I'd ever read in my life. Due to her recent surgery, emotional instability, and memory issues, we respectfully request full legal guardianship over Mrs. Darlene Whitmore to ensure her safety and proper management of her estate. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was character assassination by my own son. Mabel immediately instructed me to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation with a certified forensic psychiatrist, not just to clear my name, but to build a wall of evidence they couldn't climb, couldn't poke through. I remember sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Levitt's office. The walls were painted sage green. A lavender diffuser hummed quietly in the corner. I kept folding and unfolding a tissue in my hand, pressing its edges flat until they tore. When she called my name, I stood tall. I answered her questions with clarity, spoke of my finances, my memory, my daily routines. I even recited the grocery list I'd made that morning and named the president of Bolivia just to be petty. 2 days later, the report arrived. Mrs. Darlene Whitmore demonstrates exceptional cognitive function and psychological resilience. Evaluation shows no signs of impairment, no legal guardianship required or recommended. I read it aloud to Mabel in the living room. She grinned. "Let them try," she said. That night, I sat down with my estate planner. For 20 years, Ryan had been my primary heir, set to inherit everything after me: the house, the land, my savings, the vineyard I never told Lena existed. Every Christmas, I'd tell all myself he's just stressed. Every birthday, I excused their silence as oversight. But I wasn't blind anymore. That night, I changed everything. I Instructed the lawyer to revise my will, remove Ryan and Lena as beneficiaries. I transferred 60% of my estate into a private charitable foundation for aging women with no family. The remaining 40% would be split between my favorite library, the local hospice center, and my lifelong friend Joan, who once paid my utility bill without ever telling me. I thought I'd cry while signing the documents. I didn't, but later, when I did, I went upstairs and opened the old memory drawer. I found myself holding something I hadn't touched in years. A small white handkerchief, frayed at the edges, but neatly embroidered in sky blue thread, with the name Ryan. I stitched it myself the week after he was born. There were tiny ducks along the border. I remembered holding it against his cheek when he had a fever at 3. He used to clutch it in his tiny hands when he was scared. I sat on the edge of the bed, unfolding that handkerchief one last time. I pressed it to my lips. Inhale, pause, exhale. Then I folded it slowly. Once, twice, a third time, just like I used to fold his clothes. I placed it gently in a velvet-lined box, not to throw away, not to destroy, but to put away in a place of memory, not of future. Some things we keep, not because they're useful, but because they remind us we loved and that we tried. The next morning, I walked into the lawyer's office with a clear head and a spine made of steel. I signed the final version of the revised will. My signature didn't shake. As I stood, the assistant asked if I wanted to send a certified copy to Ryan. I paused, thought for a long second, then said, "No, let him find out the way he likes," through paperwork he didn't expect. When I got back home, I walked up to the attic, the place I used to keep baby clothes, holiday decorations, and forgotten furniture. I placed the handkerchief box gently onto a shelf next to my wedding album. Then I whispered, "Mom still keeps you in her heart, Ryan, but not in her estate." And with that, I closed the lid. Ethan, the young man from the bank, showed up at my front door with a hesitant knock and a nervous smile. "I hope it's okay I stopped by." "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I know I probably shouldn't get involved, but I've been thinking about what happened, and I want to testify on your behalf if it comes to that." His voice shook a little, but his eyes held steady. I invited him in, poured him some tea, and listened. He told me how he'd witnessed Ryan and Lena frequently accessing my accounts, how Lena once referred to me half-jokingly as the walking vault. Ethan said he'd even raised concerns internally, but was brushed off. "You deserve better than this, ma'am," he said softly, hands folded in his lap. "Thank you, Ethan," I replied, my voice calm but sure. "Most people look the other way." "I almost did," he admitted. "But then I remembered my grandmother. She used to say, 'Silence can be its own betrayal.' I couldn't stay silent. I didn't cry. I didn't hug him, but I did place my hand over his briefly, and for a moment I wasn't alone in this. That weekend, Mrs. Calderon invited me over for tea in her garden. She'd heard whispers, as most people in town had by now. We'd both lived on that street for over 30 years, raising our kids in parallel timelines, waving from across driveways, borrowing sugar and stories. I didn't expect the backyard to be full, but there they were, 6 other women, all over 65, seated around the row iron table with teacups and stories folded in their faces. "This is our informal support circle," Mrs. Calderon chuckled. "We call it the League of Unclaimed Mothers." There was laughter, brittle but real. They welcomed me like one of their own, and soon they began to share. Miriam spoke first, eyes glassy. "My daughter moved to Oregon. Left me here with nothing but a voicemail saying, 'I can't take care of you anymore. You're too much.' Mind. Forged my signature," said Clara. "I took out a loan. I didn't even know till the bank called about the debt." Dolores shook her head. "Mine married a man who convinced her I was toxic. Haven't seen her in 7 years." I sat quietly, absorbing every wound, and then someone I didn't know well, a woman named Gladys, leaned forward. She looked at me, not unkindly, but with a furrow in her brow. "Can I ask something, Darlene?" she said, gently. Are you planning to cut your son off completely? I mean, is what this court thing is about?" Everyone turned to look at me. The question wasn't hostile, just honest and raw. You could hear decades of maternal conflict behind it, love laced with disappointment, guilt mixed with longing. I didn't answer right away. I simply lifted the teapot and poured more chamomile into my own cup. The warm stream hissed softly against the porcelain. I stirred in a spoonful of honey slowly, methodically. The sound of the silver spoon clinking against the cup filled the silence. When I finally looked up, I offered a faint smile. Not defensive, not apologetic, just steady. I didn't need to say the words aloud. The gesture had said enough, because how do you explain that sometimes? Sometimes your silence is the answer. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon with the bruised pink of twilight, I sat on my porch and thought about what Gladys had asked. "Are you going to cut your son?" Cut off. What a violent phrase. Cut off like a limb, like something that was once a part of you but had rotted and needed to go to save the rest. But no, I wasn't severing my love for Ryan. That remained tucked somewhere quiet and old inside me, like a photograph from a better year, but I was severing the rope that let him drag me down with him. There's a difference. I sipped my tea, slowly, the evening breeze playing with the edge of my shawl. Inside the house, the walls were lined with memories, birthday cards, kindergarten drawings, a dent in the stair rail from when Ryan had tripped racing to open his Christmas gifts. He would always be my son, but he was no longer my guardian, no longer my decision maker, no longer my inheritor by default. Because if I've learned anything, it's this. Motherhood doesn't mean martyrdom, and forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting who hurt you. Courtrooms have a strange chill about them, not the kind that makes you shiver, but the kind that creeps into your bones and makes even your memories feel cold. I sat there in my navy suit, the same one I wore to Edward's funeral, hands folded neatly in my lap. The courtroom wasn't full, just a few. Observers, a bored-looking clerk, the judge reviewing notes behind thick glasses. Then Lena took the stand. She wore a soft gray dress and pearls I had once given her for her 35th birthday. Her makeup was subtle, but her eyes glistened the way only someone rehearsed could manage. She dabbed her cheek with a tissue before she even began. "She's paranoid," Lena said, voice cracking. "She refuses to let us visit. She's isolating from everyone. We're worried, Your Honor, deeply worried." The judge nodded slowly, pen hovering. Lena sniffled dramatically. "She wasn't always like this," she continued. "She used to be warm, caring, but after Edward passed, something changed. It's like she's become suspicious of everything, of us, and it's breaking our hearts." She clutched the tissue, like it was a lifeline. For a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. Then Ryan stepped up. He wore his best courtroom face, the one he used at investor meetings and HOA disputes. Tailored suit, glossy hair, voice steady, but laced with just enough tremble to feel human. "My mother," he began, pausing. "For effect, used to bake apple pie every Sunday. She'd volunteer at the shelter. She was the kind of woman who made strangers feel at home." He looked down at the table, shaking his head slowly. "But lately, it's like she's someone else. Cold, secretive, accusatory. I went over last week and she locked the door. She said I couldn't come in unless I scheduled a visit through a lawyer. That's not the mother I know." He looked right at me, then held it for a beat. "That's not the mother I love." My hands were calm, but inside something coiled. I didn't break eye contact. I wanted him to see me, not the version he painted. For the court. "Me?" The judge glanced at me. "Miss Whitmore, do you wish to respond now or wait for your attorney's motion?" My lawyer leaned over, whispering that it was fine to wait. I nodded once. "Didn't need to speak." "Not yet." I reached down and tightened my grip on the leather strap of my handbag. My fingers brushed against the small silver USB stick inside. a thin sliver of truth in a sea of performance. That recording, Ethan had made sure it was clear. The phone call, Lena forgot to hang up. Ryan's casual laughter in the background. Words that burned. She'll be out of the way soon anyway. She doesn't need all that money. She barely remembers what day at Island. I took a slow breath. They didn't know I had. I did. They thought this was just a performance. Another moment where they could spin stories and play the roles of heartbroken children before a judge who didn't know our history. Lena kept talking, her voice pitched. Higher now, trembling just enough to sound vulnerable. We tried everything. We brought her soup. We offered to take her to appointments, but she just keeps shutting us out. She's not safe to manage a large estate alone. We're only here because we love her. There it was. Again. That word love used like a tool, a shield, a leash. I thought about Edward then. If he were alive, he'd be furious. Not just for me, for what they were becoming. Or maybe what they always were. It was getting harder to tell. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, reviewing paperwork. My lawyer gave me a reassuring nod. I glanced around the courtroom. There was a woman in the back row, middle-aged, clutching a notebook, a reporter, perhaps, or just someone curious about the story of an elderly widow whose children thought they could rewrite her life like a contract. I sat straighter. They thought I was weak, fragile, old. But they forgot something important. I've lived through more than just grief and betrayal. I've endured war, recession, heartbreak, labor pains, and nights where the only thing that held me together was the sound of my own breath. I looked at Ryan as he returned to the table, trying not to smirk. He didn't know what I had in my bag. He didn't know today wasn't just a defense. It was the beginning of the truth breaking through their careful lies, and I wasn't going to rush it. Let them have their performance. Mine was still to come. The courtroom. I was silent when my name was called. I rose slowly, not because I was weak, but because I had learned that some steps should be taken with purpose. As I made my way to the witness stand, I didn't tremble. I didn't cry. I didn't glance toward Ryan or Lena. I adjusted my scarf, the one I wore on holidays when my husband was alive, and sat down. The judge looked at me. Mrs. Whitmore, you may begin. I took a breath. I know what they want you to believe, I said, that I've lost my mind, that grief has bent me out of shape, that I'm unstable. But what I am is awake. I could feel their stares. Lena's fake sobbing had stopped. Ryan sat back in his seat, jaw tight. I didn't look at them. I was the kind of mother who baked extra cookies for the whole team, even when Ryan missed practice. I used to sew little labels with his name into his jackets so no one else would take them by accident. Do you know what it feels like when the child you raise tells you you're just a financial burden? I paused, letting that question settle. 2 weeks after my husband passed, Lena gave me a brochure for assisted living. Not because I asked for help, not because I showed signs of needing care, but because, in her words, it's more practical for our lifestyle. And Ryan, I finally turned my eyes toward him. You. I didn't even read it. You just handed me a pen. Their lawyer objected, claiming I was emotionalizing. The judge allowed me to continue. I cooked Thanksgiving dinner last year all by myself. I roasted the turkey. I made 3 pies from scratch. And Lena brought a salad and said, "Don't overdo it. You don't bounce back like you used." 2. A soft chuckle came from somewhere in the room. I didn't smile. I wore a blue dress that day. One my husband once said made me look like a young Catherine Hepburn. When I came down the stairs, Ryan looked at me and said, "Isn't that a little much?" I let that silence sit heavy. Then slowly, I reached into my purse. Not for the USB yet, not for the big reveal, just a small note. "This I said, unfolding. "It is the grocery list I found in the trash 2 days before they staged the intervention. Written by Lena, bullet-pointed. Item number 1, to make her feel unsafe alone. Number 2, list fake symptoms, confusion, forgetfulness, insomnia. Number 3, call Dr. Brenner in advance. prep him. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. I didn't look at the defense table. I just folded the paper back up and placed it beside me. They want to paint me as paranoid. They call me difficult. But the truth is, I stopped being convenient. I could feel the room holding its breath. I'm not angry. I'm not even sad anymore. I'm just done pretending. I am a mother. I will always love my son, but I'm not their asset. I'm not a human checkbook, and I'm not going to apologize for protecting what's left of me. I paused again, then added softly, they don't call me Mom. They call me her. In their texts, in their voicemails, in their plans, they don't speak to me. They speak about me like I'm a hurdle, an expense, an inconvenience. And finally, I turned fully to the judge. I'm not mentally unwell. I'm just not willing to be used anymore. The silence that followed was heavier than any outburst could have been. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Across the room, Lena blinked like someone realizing the room had windows. Ryan clenched his jaw, but his hands trembled as he adjusted his tie. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just sat there, with my scarf neatly folded, my back straight, and my truth finally spoken. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt whole. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I didn't look back. The courtroom buzzed with a hush so thick it felt like fog clinging to my shoulders. Not a soul moved as I passed my son and daughter-in-law. Their eyes avoided mine. Their hands clenched each other's like they were the victims. But I wasn't walking in shame. I was walking in clarity. Within 24 hours, the story had hit the local news. It started small, a segment on a local evening program titled, Elderly Woman Counter Sues Children Over Estate Control. But that headline didn't hold for long. By the next morning, it had escalated into a frenzy across social media, forums, and morning talk shows. People didn't just see the lawsuit. They saw the footage of me in court, composed, measured, telling the truth without spite. And suddenly, everyone had an opinion. The comments were a battlefield. Some people sided with my children. She's probably lonely and bitter. No wonder the kids don't want her around. This is why families fall apart. Money. Always the money. But others came forward, louder, fiercer. She's not bitter, she's brave. If I had to record my kids to protect myself, I'd be heartbroken. This woman deserves peace. It wasn't, long before someone coined it. The mom who said no case. And from there, the world seemed to split into two camps. One camp argued I was heartless for pushing my own children away. They clung to the idea that parents should forgive endlessly, should be willing to be drained like an old well, because that's just what mothers do. But the other camp saw what I had hoped they would, that this wasn't about revenge. This was about preservation, about boundaries, about finally stepping out of the role they forced me into and standing in my own name, not just mom or grandma or the widow. Mabel, bless her soul, handled the first wave of calls from reporters. Her phone rang off the hook. People wanted interviews, daytime shows, podcasts, legal analysts dissecting every word I said. I stayed out of it. I didn't watch the news. I didn't read the comments. But Mabel did. And what I didn't tell me. Her expression did. She grew more alert, more protective. She double-checked the locks before bedtime. She started driving by my house late at night just to make sure it hadn't been tampered with. One morning, she confessed she'd received a call that made her voice shake. A stranger saying I'd burn in hell for destroying my children's future. I thanked her, hugged her, and told her what I believed. I didn't destroy anything. I just refused to keep building a house they kept trying to set on fire. But I won't lie and say it didn't rattle me. It did. One morning, I found a torn letter shoved under my mailbox. It read, "Rot alone. No wonder they don't want you." I didn't cry. I just folded it in half, placed it in a drawer, and brewed a pot of chamomile tea. And then I sat by the window with my roses and sipped it. Slowly, I understood something. Then this world will always have people who believe that Mother's silence, that we should go to our graves with our tongues bitten and our dignity buried beside us. But I wasn't raised that way, and I wasn't going to die that way. I wasn't chasing validation. I didn't want to become a martyr or a media hero. I just wanted to breathe, to walk into my kitchen and not feel like every tile was laid by guilt, to tend to my garden without replaying the voicemail Ryan never meant me to hear, to wear my favorite robe and not wonder if I was seen as in the way, to live the last chapters of my life on my terms, quietly, peacefully, honestly. When a reporter eventually cornered me outside the grocery store, young, sharp-suited, with a camera rolling, I paused. She asked, "Mrs. Whitmore, how does it feel to have the entire town talking about you?" I looked her straight in the eye and answered truthfully, "I'm not here to be talked about. I'm here to be free." She blinked. The cameraman adjusted focus, but I was already pushing my cart down the next aisle. People think power is about noise, but sometimes it's just about not explaining yourself anymore. That week, I planted new hydrangeas in the front yard. They were blue, calm, like the silence I'd waited my whole life to earn. And while the world bickered about whether I was a villain or a victim, I sat under the porch light, penning a letter to no one in particular. It simply read, "I don't live to be understood. I live to be at peace." And I meant every word. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the slow tick of the bailiff's wristwatch. I sat still, back straight, hands folded gently in my lap. The judge was rereading something, brows furrowed, lips moving as he scanned the lines of the final report. For a long moment it felt like no one dared to breathe. My attorney, Miss Hargrove, glanced at me with the calm steadiness of someone who already knew what was coming. Then finally, he spoke. "This court finds that Mrs. Darlene Whitmore is of sound mind and in full legal capacity to manage her own estate, assets, and personal affairs." I heard an audible gasp to my right. The petition for legal guardianship filed by Mr. Ryan Whitmore and Mrs. Lena Whitmore is hereby denied in its entirety. There was a pause, and the court notes with concern the evidence submitted regarding manipulation, financial coercion, and attempted undue influence toward the respondent. While no criminal charges are being filed, today all rights and access to the respondent's property and finances by the petitioners are henceforth revoked. A whisper rippled across the courtroom. Gallery. From the corner of my eye, I saw Ryan slump in his chair, face flushed a deep red. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted across the room like a trapped animal searching for a hole in the floor. Lena let out a sharp cry, the kind that wasn't from grief, but disbelief. A sound born of loss, not of love. She buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking, her carefully set hair trembling with her sobs. For a second, I thought she might say something cruel, dramatic, but she didn't. Maybe she could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, or maybe once she understood there was nothing left to say. "Me?" I rose slowly from my round seat. I didn't look at them, not even once, not even as I heard Ryan mutter, "This isn't over," under his breath. Not even as Lena whimpered, "We needed that money." I simply turned to the judge and bowed my head softly. "Thank you, Your Honor," I said with all the grace I had left inside me. Then I walked down that long center aisle of the courtroom, heels tapping with quiet confidence, past rows of strangers, reporters, whispers. I walked with my spine tall, my face calm, my heart steady. No smile, no tears, just peace. Because in that moment, I wasn't walking away from them. I was walking back to myself. The woman who had built a life, baked cookies, folded sheets, balanced checkbooks, held hands, paid hospital bills, read bedtime stories, sat in waiting rooms, paid off mortgages, sent birthday cards, listened to lies, and still chose love until love was pressing us, weaponized against her. And now love was no longer my weakness, it was my shield, my boundary, my mirror. Outside, the sky was a dull silver, not stormy, not bright. just quietly honest. I didn't call Mabel. I didn't take interviews. I didn't stop when a local reporter ran after me asking, "Mrs. Whitmore, how does it feel to win?" I kept walking, because this wasn't a win. This was a release. Back in the car, I finally exhaled. Miss Hargrove sat beside me and said, "You were magnificent in it there." And all I could whisper was, "Thank you for helping me remember I wasn't crazy." "No," she said, starting the engine. "You were never crazy, Darlene. You were just surrounded by people who needed you to doubt yourself. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself a small, gentle smile. It didn't last long because I knew the war was over, but the ache would linger. But it was my ache, my story, my name, and they could no longer write it for me." The morning after the court hearing, I packed just one suitcase and quietly handed the keys of the old house to my lawyer, who would handle the transfer back to my name. I didn't tell Ryan. I didn't need to. He would find out soon enough on paper, in bold print, just like he wanted everything to be. But I was done living on his terms. I used some of the remaining money James had left me. Not the big fund, just a modest trust he set aside years ago to lease a small apartment on the coast. Nothing grand, nothing to show off. Just a quiet one-bedroom space where the breeze carried the scent of the sea and the sun poured through sheer white curtains like honey. There was a narrow balcony that overlooked a lavender field planted by the previous tenant, long neglected. I trimmed it, nurtured it, watered it gently in the evenings. I used to hate the smell of lavender when I was younger. Too strong, too sharp. But now, it reminded me of resilience, the kind that blooms quietly, even in cracked soil. I bought a second-hand easel from the local thrift shop. The woman behind the counter said, "It belonged to my sister. She painted sayscapes until arthritis." Took her hands. I nodded, gave her an extra $20, and promised to give it new life. The first time I held a paintbrush again, I was clumsy. I forgot how to mix colors, how to hold my wrist, but I let myself be bad at it. I didn't need perfection. I needed expression. Some days I just dipped the brush into blue and dragged it across the canvas. That was enough. That was release. A flyer outside the local library caught my eye one morning. Thursday mornings, Women's Creative Circle, 60 plus. I hesitated before picking it up. For so long, I had only belonged to one identity, Ryan's mother, Lena's enemy, James's widow. But I was curious what else I could be. I showed up to the next session, nervous in my oversized cardigan and sun hat. They welcomed me like an old friend. Ruth baked scones, Elise brought watercolors, Joanne made inappropriate jokes about online dating, and everyone laughed till their eyes watered. As weeks passed, we shared more than art. We shared stories of adult children who never called, of second chances, of garden tomatoes, of grief. Some of these women had been left, others had escaped in different ways, but we were all survivors, each bearing the quiet marks of what we had lived through. In that shared space, I was no longer a file at the courthouse or a line item on a ledger. I was simply Darlene, a woman relearning how to draw roses from memory, stitch by careful stitch. I even joined the town book club, an odd thing for a woman who barely read fiction before, and found myself sitting at a round table with women who argued over endings like they argued about recipes. One evening, someone asked, "What is your favorite quote of all time?" I hesitated, then answered, plain and true, "I'm not starting over. I am continuing the life that got left behind." The room settled. Ruth, who always carried a cup of tea like a small lamp, nodded slowly. "That's the most honest thing I've heard in years," she said. Sometimes, late at night, I still thought of Ryan and Lena, not with the hot sting of bitterness, but with a slow, careful curiosity. What story did they tell about the court? Did Ryan ever stand before a mirror and see himself without flinching? Had Lena realized even once that I was never the obstacle, she was the one who burned the bridge before she even crossed it? I never gave them a forwarding address. I did not block their numbers either. They simply stopped calling. That silence became, in an odd way, a kind of freedom. Every Thursday I walked to a tiny studio by the pier and painted. Lavender skies bruised into evening, waves folded themselves like soft linen against the shore. I learned how to make purple with the right hint of blue and the subtlest red, how to turn what feels like a bruise into twilight. Gradually, silence ceased to feel like absence. It became a blank page, a place for growth and stillness and small mercies. I did not miss the old house in the way that grief imagines you will. I did not miss the ceaseless tallying of my worth by a son's glance. I did not even miss being called Mom by the kind of voice that only said it when wanting something. Here, among women who carried their scars in laugh lines and paint-stained fingers, I found something no judge could give me, a second life, unequivocally mine. 2 months after I moved into the quiet apartment by the coast, a letter came handwritten, calm blue ink folded into a neat envelope. Not an email, not a text, a real letter. It arrived from a nonprofit called Mothers in Silence, an organization that ran seminars on elder rights, estate abuse, and emotional healing. One of their board members had read about my case. She wrote gently that my story had sparked debate, and she offered hope. Would I consider speaking at their national conference that fall? The theme was Inheritance and a Mother's Quiet Voice. I held that letter for a long time. My fingers trembled, not from fear but from the strange weight of being seen, not as a litigant, nor merely as a victim, nor only as someone's mother, but as a woman who had endured and come through. For a moment I wanted to say no, to remain tucked in my lavender garden, to sketch waves and the weathered faces of new friends. Then I remembered what a friend from book club had said after we read The Glass Castle. Silence keeps the shame in place. Stories set it free. So I said yes. I prepared not a spectacle but a story, my story written by hand on lined paper, the way I like to live, slow, intentional, honest. I did not rehearse in front of mirrors. I did not hire a coach. I wrote the truth the way I had once packed lunches, careful, with small notes folded inside. When I opened my keepsake box to gather souvenirs for the talk, a handkerchief fell into my lap, the one Walter had given me the night we signed our wills. I had embroidered it years ago with the words, "Everything I am, I give to you." The thread had faded, but the cloth had survived washings, moving boxes, courtrooms, and tears. I pressed it to my chest until my pulse slowed, then threaded a needle with lavender silk and stitched a new line beneath the old, a quiet amendment, "I choose me." The day of the conference arrived. I wore navy because I would not drape myself in mourning for something I had already buried. I wanted to look like someone who had walked through a storm and was no longer dripping from it. The hall smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. Mostly women filled the chairs, older, variously brave, some in wheelchairs, some with silver hair like a soft halo. A few men sat quietly at the edges, holding hands with wives who had learned to speak. When I stepped to the podium, the light was too bright for my unpracticed eyes and my palms were damp. I could have read statistics. I could have recited legal precedent. Instead, I did what I had rehearsed on paper in the small hours. I told the truth. I told them about the nursing home dinner, where whispers slid like knives, about the midnight calls that sounded like imagination, about the legal filings and the way Lena's voice iced the room, and how Ryan's eyes could look like plaster. I told them about rosemary in my garden and the weight of silence I had carried for too long. I did not speak angrily. I did not ask for pity. I told how I walked away, not in victory but in setting boundaries. At the end, I unfolded the handkerchief and held it up. The room breathed. Some women wept. Others nodded as if they had been waiting for someone to say what they had only felt. Afterward, a woman in her 70s with a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders approached. "My daughter told me I owed her everything because I stayed home," she said. "Thank you for reminding me I am more than what I gave." We hugged until our shoulders ached. That evening, in my small hotel room, the city lights blinked like a constellation of distant, indifferent stars. I folded the handkerchief and placed it on the nightstand. I poured a small glass of wine and felt something I had not felt in years, a voice returning to me, not loud but steady. I smiled, not because I had won anything, but because I had reclaimed something I hadn't known. I'd lost my own voice, and for once, I listened to it. Back home, I found a cafe on the boardwalk, where the sea and sky met without a seam, the light dissolving into gentle pewter. The chairs were uneven, the coffee too bitter, the napkins made of recycled newspaper, but it was exactly what I needed. I began keeping a journal again. Its pages smelled faintly of old roses and ink. I uncapped my pen with hands that shook just a little, not from fear, but from the slow lifting of decades of weight. I wrote to the younger me, the one who cried in the laundry room because it was the only place they wouldn't follow, and told her everything she needed to hear. "Dear me," I wrote, "I know you fold their shirts neater than you fold your own dreams. I know you stayed silent to avoid being called difficult or dramatic. You think the day they pushed you out was the end. It was not. It was the opening of the cage." I told her that hope was not a miracle, but a decision, small, steady, and hers to make. Outside, the ocean breathed in and out, indifferent and faithful. The world did not notice my quiet reclaiming. No headlines, no ribbon cutting, only the slow, honest work of showing up for myself. A waitress paused at my table. "Need anything else, ma'am?" she asked. I smiled. "Just the check and maybe one more sunrise tomorrow." Before I left, I flipped to the last page of the journal and wrote a line I had been breathing like a secret for months. They planned their lives around my death. I started living while I still had time. For the first time since the voice message that cracked my world open, I did not feel late. I felt exactly where I was supposed to be, right on time.